A wall of gold fills the frame, and at its center a woman sits enthroned, her blue robe folded in long unbroken lines, a child balanced on her knee with one small hand raised in blessing. Around her, in tight ranked rows, saints and angels turn their faces toward her, each one painted with its own tilt of the head, its own weight of gaze. The gold behind them is not flat. Look closely and it catches the light in small punched patterns, halos stamped one strike at a time with metal tools pressed into the surface by hand, each pattern repeated with the kind of patience that only comes from years of practiced, repetitive craft. This is the front of the Maestà, finished in Siena in 1311 by the painter Duccio di Buoninsegna, and on the day it was carried through the streets to the cathedral, the city is said to have closed its shops so the whole population could walk behind it. What almost no one standing in front of this panel today realizes is that they are looking at less than half of what Duccio actually painted. The altarpiece once had another face entirely, an entire second surface covered in dozens of small scenes from the life of Christ, and that surface no longer exists as one object. It was sawn apart. Pieces of it crossed oceans. At least one piece is lost outright, its location unknown for over 2 centuries. No one could say with certainty how the missing scenes had originally been arranged. Then conservators went looking for the answer inside the paint itself. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The question that opens this story only makes sense once you understand what Siena was asking Duccio to build. In the first years of the 1300s, Siena was a republic at the height of its wealth, a banking and wool trading city that saw itself in direct rivalry with Florence, and its cathedral chapter wanted an altarpiece that would announce that rivalry in paint. Duccio was already the city's most established and most sought-after painter, trained since youth in a workshop tradition that had come north out of Byzantium through Constantinople and into Italy by way of Byzantine icon painters working in Venice and Pisa. That tradition gave Western panel painting its gold grounds, its frontal, symmetrical figures, its flattened sense of space where holiness was expressed through stillness rather than movement. Duccio had spent decades working inside that visual language, and by the time the cathedral signed him to a formal contract in the autumn of 1308, he was already known for pushing softly against its edges, letting a fold of drapery curve where an older painter would have kept it rigid, letting a face tilt where convention demanded it face forward. The contract survives, and it tells you something the painting alone cannot. Duccio was to be paid by the day, supplied with the gold and the pigments by the cathedral itself, and he was bound not to work on anything else until the altarpiece was finished. This was not a commission handed to a workshop and collected later. It was 3 years of one man's attention, assisted by others but directed, panel by panel, by his own hand. Duccio himself had come up through a training that reached back, generation by generation, to painters working in Constantinople, filtered into Italy through the port cities that traded with the Byzantine East. That inheritance shows in the flattened gold backgrounds behind every figure in the Maestà, gold standing in for a timeless, placeless heaven, rather than any sky a viewer could recognize from daily life. It shows in the frontal poses, the elongated fingers, the way drapery falls in patterned rhythms, rather than following gravity the way a real piece of cloth would. Siena in the early 1300s was also a city measuring itself constantly against Florence, its larger and increasingly dominant rival across the hills, and civic pride in Siena's own painting tradition was not a minor concern for the men negotiating Duccio's contract. A generation later, painters trained partly in Duccio's own workshop, among them Simone Martini and the brothers Pietro and Ambrogio Lorenzetti, would carry the style he was refining forward into what art historians now call the Sienese school, a tradition distinct enough from Florentine painting of the same period that it is still taught as its own line of development. None of that later flowering explains itself without this specific altarpiece standing near its root, which is part of why the condition of what survives from it and the accuracy of what has been reconstructed from its fragments has mattered so much to scholars working on this period. The physical object he built was enormous by the standards of the period, a double-sided altarpiece meant to be seen from both the nave and the choir, since the high altar in Siena Cathedral stood in the middle of the church rather than pushed against a back wall. The front carried the image everyone remembers, the enthroned Virgin and Child surrounded by a crowd of Sienese patron saints, with a predella of small scenes below and a row of pinnacle panels above. Instead of one large composition, it held roughly 40 small narrative scenes, arranged in a grid, tracing the last days of Christ's life, from the entry into Jerusalem, through the Passion, and into the appearances after the resurrection. A worshipper standing in the choir, facing the back of the altarpiece, would have read this sequence the way you might read a page of dense, small illustrations, moving scene to scene, while a worshipper in the nave saw only the single, monumental image of the Virgin. Two audiences, two visual experiences, one altarpiece. The back's 40 scenes moved through the story in careful sequence, small painted rooms and landscapes holding the entry into Jerusalem, the washing of the disciples' feet, the Last Supper, the agony in a garden lit by a single lantern, the arrest, the interrogations before the religious and civil authorities, the denial by a disciple caught twice more by a servant girl's question, the flagellation, the mockery, the walk to the execution ground, the crucifixion itself at the sequence's center, the deposition, the burial, and then the appearances afterward, a woman mistaking a risen man for a gardener, two travelers on a road recognizing a stranger, only once he broke bread with them. Each scene measures barely more than a large book page, and each one had to carry its own architectural setting, its own gathering of figures, its own emotional register, distinct from the scene beside it, while still reading as part of one continuous account when viewed together from the choir. It is an extraordinary amount of narrative compression for a painter working largely with a brush a few bristles wide, and it is exactly this density of small, individually staged scenes that made the back so vulnerable once it was separated from the front. A single large image survives or is destroyed as one object, kept whole because no one has any easy way to divide it. 40 small ones, each already framed as its own self-contained composition, can be sold off one at a time to 40 different buyers without any single purchaser ever needing to grasp what they were breaking apart in the process. What the front alone does not tell you is how much Duccio changed his approach across those 40 small scenes on the back, and this is where the trouble starts, because in 1771, tastes had moved on. The Cathedral chapter, working within a Baroque sensibility that had little patience for gold-ground panel painting, decided the altarpiece no longer suited the space and ordered it removed from the high altar. It was not preserved intact in storage. It was cut into pieces. The main front panel and the back panel were separated from each other, and the back was further broken down into its individual scenes, some of which were then sold off over the following decades to dealers, collectors, and eventually museums scattered across 2 continents. A handful of the predella and pinnacle panels stayed together with the main front section and eventually returned to Siena. Others did not. One small scene showing Christ's temptation in the wilderness crossed the Atlantic and now hangs in a private collection turned public museum in New York. Another, showing the raising of Lazarus, was purchased in the early 2000s by a museum in Fort Worth, Texas, for a sum reported in the tens of millions of dollars, a figure that made headlines partly because so few complete Duccio panels ever reached the open market at all. 3 more scenes, including the Annunciation and the healing of a man born blind, made their way to London. At least one panel has never been located since the 18th century sale. No inventory from the dismantling survives that records, scene by scene, which panel sat next to which. The removal itself was carried out with the kind of practical indifference that makes later historians wince. Workmen using saws on wood that had already stood for 460 years, prying gilded frames apart to fit whatever storage or resale plan the cathedral officials had settled on. Some fragments stayed in Sienese hands for decades before eventually reaching the open market. Others left the city almost immediately, passing through a chain of dealers whose own records are incomplete, so that tracing a single small panel's ownership across the 18th and 19th centuries sometimes means working from auction catalogs, private letters, and the occasional customs record, rather than any single continuous chain of title. For nearly 200 years, the only way to guess at the original sequence on the back was to compare styles and guess at a narrative logic, which is a soft kind of evidence, the kind that produces confident essays and disagreeing footnotes in equal measure, with different scholars proposing different orderings for the same handful of surviving scenes, depending on which stylistic details they weighted most heavily. This is where restoration stopped being about cleaning varnish and started being detective work. Over the 20th century, and especially as infrared reflectography became available to conservators studying old panel paintings, technical examination of the surviving fragments of Duccio's altarpiece began turning up something the naked eye had never been able to see. Beneath the finished paint layer of several panels, conservators found underdrawing, the preparatory lines an artist scores directly onto the white gesso ground before laying down any pigment at all. Underdrawing is usually the most private part of a painting's making, invisible once the final layer covers it, and in a handful of the Maestà fragments, it does not match the composition that ended up painted. In one scene, a hand originally drawn pointing in one direction was painted pointing in another. In another panel, the angle of a figure's shoulders was shifted after the underdrawing was already laid in, narrowing the space between two bodies that the drawing had left more open. These are small changes. They are also exactly the kind of change that only shows up when an artist is actively deciding, mid-execution, that the version he sketched is not the version he wants. The technique behind this discovery depends on a simple physical fact about how Trecento panels were built. Duccio worked on poplar wood prepared with a smooth white ground made from gypsum and animal glue, and before any paint touched that surface, he or an assistant sketched the composition directly onto the dried gesso, usually with a charcoal or diluted ink line, sometimes reinforced afterward with a fine brush. Egg tempera, the paint medium used throughout the altarpiece, is largely transparent to infrared light in its thinner passages, while the carbon-based underdrawing beneath it absorbs infrared strongly. Point an infrared camera at the finished panel, and, in the right conditions, the paint layer becomes partially invisible to the sensor, while the drawing underneath stays sharp, producing an image of the artist's first decisions, superimposed, ghost-like, beneath everything he chose to paint over them. This is not a new technology invented specifically for Duccio scholarship. It has been used across old master painting for decades. What makes its application to the Maestà fragments unusual is the sheer number of independent institutions holding pieces of a single dismembered object, each with its own conservation department, each running its own infrared study on its own schedule, for its own reasons, only for the results to be compared later, sometimes decades apart. Once curators organizing loan exhibitions began placing the technical findings from Siena, London, Fort Worth, and New York, side by side, for the first time. What emerges from that comparison is not one dramatic single discovery but an accumulation of small, consistent ones. A hand redrawn, a gap between two figures narrowed, a halo's position adjusted by a matter of centimeters, once the head beneath it had already been painted. None of these changes would justify a headline on its own. Together, examined across a dozen or more fragments that had not been compared to each other in this way before, they describe a working method, a painter who treated even a formally contracted, publicly commissioned altarpiece as something he was still willing to revise as he went, scene by scene, right up until the final layer of paint made revision impossible. One of the clearest examples sits in the scene of Christ healing a man born blind, one of the fragments now held in London. The finished composition places the two central figures close together against a spare architectural background, the moment of touch isolated so the viewer's eye has nowhere else to go. Infrared examination of the underdrawing shows that Duccio originally sketched a larger crowd filling the space around them, a more conventional way of staging a public miracle. Onlookers reacting, gesturing, filling the background with the kind of narrative bustle that earlier Byzantine-influenced painting often used to signal that an event mattered. He then thinned that crowd down in the painted version, removing figures the drawing had already placed, until only the essential exchange between two people remained visible. That is a compositional decision made after the sketch was already committed to the gesso, and it points toward exactly the kind of narrowing focus, the preference for a single legible emotional exchange over a crowded, symbolically busy scene, that later Sienese painting would make one of its defining qualities. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The second technical thread runs through the gold itself, and it comes from a completely different kind of evidence. The punch marks stamped into the gilded backgrounds behind every figure. In Trecento panel painting, decorative halos and borders were not painted at all. They were created by pressing small metal punches, each with its own carved tip, into the gold leaf laid over the gesso, one strike producing one tiny raised or indented shape, repeated in patterns to build a halo's decorative border, or a saint's embroidered hem. Every punch tool wears down with use in its own particular way, developing small nicks and irregularities that make its mark as distinct, under close examination, as a worn stamp or a fingerprint. Scholars studying Sienese panel painting have used this fact for decades to trace which punches appear across multiple paintings, and by extension, which workshop, and sometimes which individual hand within that workshop, produced a given panel. Applied to the scattered fragments of Duccio's altarpiece, punch mark analysis has helped confirm that while Duccio directed the whole commission and painted large sections of it personally, certain smaller predella scenes show punchwork matching tools used elsewhere by assistants in his workshop. Evidence of a large commission completed under real-time pressure, with a master delegating passages of a project he could not have finished alone in 3 years working at the pace a single hand allows. This kind of analysis depends on comparing tool wear across many paintings at once, building up what amounts to a reference catalog of individual punches and the specific damage patterns that identify them, then checking a new panel's gilding against that catalog the way an investigator might check a tool mark against a database. A single matching punch proves little on its own, since tools were sometimes shared, sold, or passed between workshops in the same city. A cluster of several matching punches appearing together across multiple panels, in the same relative arrangement, is much harder to explain except by common authorship or common ownership of a specific set of tools at a specific moment. Where that kind of cluster shows up in a predella scene attributed to an assistant rather than to Duccio himself, it becomes possible to say with reasonable confidence not just that the altarpiece involved workshop help, which no one seriously doubted, but roughly which scenes received it and which did not, giving scholars a working map of where Duccio's own hand touched the wood directly and where it did not. Put those two threads together, the underdrawing and the gold, and something larger comes into focus, something that a 19th century art historian looking only at the surviving front panel could never have argued with confidence. The textbook version of Duccio's career, for a long time, described a painter who began in a fully Byzantine mode and only gradually, across separate commissions spread over years, worked his way toward the more naturalistic, more emotionally legible style associated with the Sienese Gothic school that followed him, painters like Simone Martini and the Lorenzetti brothers. The physical evidence inside the Maestà complicates that timeline considerably. The changes visible in the underdrawing, the repositioned hands, the tightened compositions, the small adjustments toward more direct emotional contact between figures are not spread across separate paintings made years apart. They are happening inside a single 3-year commission, panel by panel, sometimes within a single panel, covered over by the final paint layer before anyone outside Duccio's own workshop could see the process. The shift that Sienese painting is remembered for making was not, at least in part, a slow evolution across a career. It was something worked out in real time, under the gold leaf, on the surface of one enormous altarpiece, and then buried the moment the final coat of pigment went down. There is a way of describing the front panel that treats it as a finished, settled thing, a single confident statement of what Sienese devotional painting could achieve. The technical evidence argues for something closer to a working notebook that happened to also be a masterpiece, a surface where a painter was still testing what a face could hold, what a hand should point toward, while an entire cathedral chapter and a paying city waited for the result. What survives of the back panels, scattered as they now are across Siena, Fort Worth, London, and New York, carries that same evidence wherever infrared has been able to look beneath the paint. The predella scene of Christ healing a blind man, now in London, shows underdrawing for a crowd of onlookers that was later thinned out in the final composition, tightening the viewer's focus onto the two central figures rather than the surrounding spectacle. That is not the mark of an artist executing a settled formula. It is the mark of an artist editing himself, panel after panel, towards something sharper. None of this would be visible without the specific historical accident that forced conservators to look this closely in the first place. Had the altarpiece never been dismantled, had it remained a single intact object mounted on the high altar for 7 centuries, there would have been far less reason for museums on 2 continents to independently subject small fragments of it to infrared study, punchmark comparison, and dendrochronological analysis of the wood itself. The destruction of 1771 scattered evidence across institutions with very different resources and very different reasons to examine what they owned closely. And it is the accumulation of those separate examinations, compared against each other only in recent decades as museums began lending fragments to joint exhibitions, that has slowly reassembled a picture of how the altarpiece was actually built. The wood grain along the sawn edges of several panels has been matched against each other, confirming physical adjacency that style alone had only guessed at. Wormholes running through more than one fragment, invisible on the painted surface, line up precisely where 2 panels once sat side by side, giving conservators a kind of forensic confirmation that a purely visual argument about narrative sequence never could have provided on its own. Some proposed sequences from earlier in the 20th century have had to be revised once the physical evidence came in. A few still remain uncertain, and where the wood does not offer a clean, decisive answer, No restorer has claimed one. The single missing panel from the 18th century sale remains missing. Its subject can be inferred from the narrative gap it leaves in the sequence, but its appearance cannot, and every published reconstruction of the back of the altarpiece today marks that gap honestly, rather than filling it with invention. What this means for the object hanging today in the front room of the museum in Siena is that it can no longer be read the way it was read for most of its history, as a single, static image of Sienese piety and civic pride, complete in itself. It has to be read as one surviving face of a painter's live negotiation with the visual language he inherited, a negotiation that happened to leave physical traces because it happened to be interrupted, centuries later, by a bishop's changing taste and a saw. The evidence supports a narrower verdict than that, closer to the actual, ordinary texture of how a large workshop commission gets built under a fixed deadline, with a demanding client and a whole city waiting on the outcome. Duccio was solving a problem in real time, panel by panel, about how much stillness a holy figure could give up before it stopped reading as holy, and how much human feeling a face could carry before it stopped reading as an icon and started reading as a person. The underdrawing shows him testing that boundary, and then, sometimes, pulling back from it, and sometimes pushing further than his first sketch had dared. That is not the record of a settled master executing a known formula for 3 years. It is the record of an artist working out, inside a single enormous commission, the terms of an entire regional painting tradition that would define Sienese art for the following century. Earlier generations of scholarship, working only from the surviving finished surface and from comparisons to other paintings attributed to Duccio at different points in his career, tended to describe his stylistic development the way a biography describes a life, as a sequence of separate chapters, each associated with a different commission, moving in a roughly straight line from a more rigid early manner toward a softer, more humanized late manner. That narrative is tidy, and it is largely how Duccio was taught for much of the 20th century. The underdrawing evidence does not demolish it so much as complicate it in a way that matters. If the same softening, the same narrowing of focus toward direct emotional contact between figures can be observed happening within the boundaries of one 3-year commission, visible only because the artist changed his mind after the sketch stage and before the final paint stage, then the old model of steady, chapter-by-chapter development across separate paintings starts to look less like an accurate description of how Duccio actually worked and more like a convenient shape imposed afterward by historians who could only see finished surfaces, never the decisions buried beneath them. That distinction is not a small correction confined to specialist journals. It changes what the Maestà is understood to be as an object. A painting that demonstrates a style is one kind of historical document. A painting that shows a style being decided, argued with itself, and settled panel by panel under time pressure and cathedral oversight is a different and considerably more valuable kind of evidence, because it captures a moment of active change rather than a finished result of change that already happened somewhere else, off the record, in commissions that either no longer survive or were never subjected to this level of technical study. The base of the enthroned Virgin's seat on the surviving front panel carries a painted inscription addressed to her directly, asking that she keep the city safe and grant peace to those who commissioned the work in her honor, a plea that reads differently once you know how anxious this particular city had reason to be. Siena had tied its own civic identity to the Virgin's protection since a battle fought half a century earlier, when the city's leaders were said to have dedicated Siena to her care before facing an army that outnumbered them and won anyway. The Maestà was not simply devotional furniture. It was closer to a civic contract, rendered in gold and egg tempera, a public promise that the city's fortunes and the Virgin's favor were bound together, displayed at the exact geographic and symbolic center of Sienese religious life. Every technical detail recovered from the fragments, every repositioned hand, every matched punch mark, sits underneath that larger civic weight, a private process of artistic decision-making buried inside an object that was never meant to be read as private at all. Today, what survives of the front panel and its predella and pinnacle scenes has been reunited inside a dedicated room of the museum attached to Siena Cathedral, close enough to its original site that visitors can walk the same short distance the panel once traveled during its dismantling, only in reverse. The room is built specifically to let visitors circle the piece and see both sides that survive together, something no worshipper standing in the medieval cathedral was ever able to do, since the altarpiece stood with its two faces permanently divided by its own position on the high altar. Several of the scattered narrative scenes remain abroad, on loan or in permanent collections that have no plans to part with them, physically distant from the panel they were painted to sit beside for 700 years. Conservators in Siena, London, Fort Worth, and New York have, at various points over the last several decades, lent their fragments to joint exhibitions specifically so the technical study could continue across institutional lines, comparing infrared results and punch patterns from panels that had not hung within reach of each other since the year they were sawn apart. The missing panel is still missing. No one currently expects that to change. Each of those loans requires insurance valuations, climate-controlled transport, and the kind of institutional cooperation that does not happen quickly or often, which is part of why a complete physical reunion of every surviving fragment in one room has never actually taken place, and likely never will. What visitors get instead, in Siena and in each of the museums holding a separated scene, is a partial view, accompanied now by reproductions or descriptions of the fragments held elsewhere, so that even standing in front of the original wood in Fort Worth or London, a viewer is only ever looking at one piece of an argument that has to be assembled, mentally, from research conducted somewhere else entirely. The altarpiece exists today less as a single object in a single place than as a body of evidence distributed across 4 cities and 3 countries, held together by publications, infrared scans, and punchmark catalogs rather than by its own physical wood. What stays with you, standing in front of the surviving gold wall in Siena, is not simply the scale of it, though the scale is real. A wooden panel more than 16 feet across covered edge to edge, in figures painted at a moment when the whole language of Western religious art was still deciding what a human face on a gold ground was permitted to feel. What stays with you is the knowledge, now available only because a cathedral chapter once took a saw to something they no longer valued, that underneath every one of those calm, gold-framed faces is a version that came before it, a drawn hand pointing somewhere else, a shoulder set at a different angle, a decision made and then unmade by a painter working 3 years against a deadline, 700 years before anyone thought to look beneath the paint and ask what he had changed his mind about. The next time you stand in front of a gold ground panel from this period, remember that stillness is not always what it looks like. Sometimes it is a decision, arrived at more than once, revised under time pressure, and painted over the version that came before it, so completely that 700 years passed before anyone thought to look beneath the surface and check. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.